Summer, I know this is a fairly new piece for you, but I want to talk about some basic perceptions in the piece which ultimately will impact on the way you look at the music and the way you memorize the music when that comes around, because you'll know the music and memorization then will be a simple process. In my more than 30 years teaching experience, the major challenge for students in memorizing music comes from the fact that they think of it far too late in the process, and when they do think of it, they don't organize it very well, so that it's haphazard and usually rather pressured. One can ask oneself if there is a single most effective technique for memorizing. I think it's a combination of techniques, and if I had to call a single factor, I would say that it is the procedure. The tradition of memorized performance was part and parcel of the rise of the virtuoso image at the early part of the 19th century. The virtuoso at that point was out there playing the role of the superstar. And not only did they want to play their violin or their piano in such a way that it technically amazed everyone, they wanted to do it without the notes, so that people indeed would think, not only do they play all those notes, but they remember all of those notes. Oftentimes, after a recital, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, a layperson will come up to you or a performer and say, "How do you remember all those notes?" My answer usually is, well, a little bit of luck most of the time. Actually, luck is not what this lecture is going to be about. The fact of the matter is that there are some benefits to memorizing the score. They're hard-won benefits because memorization is very hard work. The first benefit is simply the fact that in order to memorize a score, you are invited to a process of detailed analysis. You're invited to look at every detail of the score. You're invited to work with the score in segments, to work with first one hand and then the other hand. And in so doing, you begin to gain an understanding of the score that simply repetition over and over with the music might not engender. There is also a kind of psychological message that is sent both to the audience and is to some degree shared by the performer. And that message is that once the score is memorized, the music is not somehow objectified up there on a music desk. And you're not thus performing a service by playing the notes on this object. You are rather playing something that has been internalized. And in playing it this way, the communication is somehow more direct, more intimate, and more powerful. There's yet another advantage to memorization, and that goes hand in hand with the kind of music that was on the rise in the early part of the 19th century. It was music which had a physical dimension with regard to the keyboard. It was music which used the extreme ends of the keyboard. It was music where indeed the performer was supposed to skip dramatically, whether with octaves or whether with chords. All of these things required a kind of athleticism at the keyboard, and indeed being able to view the keyboard and have a relationship with the keyboard without the notes up there could be efficacious for this kind of display. So these are all the things that memorization can, in fact, engender. On the other hand, memorization is a boogaboo. If not a boogaboo, at least it's an onerous task. And I know that even with my students, and I teach lots of gifted students on the college level, with my students, even those who know that they need to memorize it, it's something that is left to the very last minute to do. It's often chug-a-lugged, meaning they have that date and they have to gulp it down. And indeed, once the performance has been memorized and done, it is seldom practiced. The performance is over with. Therefore, you don't have to have the piece memorized anymore, and regular practice of memorized material is seldom part of a student's schedule if they are not prompted. We all know that there is a process which many students call memorization. I certainly see it in my studio. And that process is one by which the student simply repeats with the music a section of the music, and they play it several times, and then they kind of slip the music away and see if they can do it again. And that is tentatively memorization. That process can lead to great insecurity if it is not, in fact, bolstered by other processes. And we're going to talk about a lot of those processes. We know that if that insecurity develops in a performance, that a traumatic experience can result. As a result, memorization becomes something that is terrible, something that is frightful, literally, inspiring sweaty palms. Not because they can't play the music, but they don't know if on the spot they can play a memorized performance of the music. But notwithstanding the fact that many people have questioned the efficacy of memorized performance, indeed, we can use music with chamber music. We oftentimes use music with contemporary works which are extremely complex. Once in a while, we will see someone who undertakes a performance of a major traditional masterwork of unusual length or complexity. The Goldberg variations of Bach comes to mind, and people use score for this. But by and large, notwithstanding these exceptions, we still have a situation in the profession where most teachers want memorized performances for student recitals. Most festivals and student competitions expect memorized performances. If a student goes on to study and has to play an entrance audition at a college or an exam at the end of a semester or a degree recital, then memorized performance is expected. And indeed, some master teachers even expect memorized performance for the lessons. And finally, if you pay your high ticket price to see a recognized artist of renown at your music center, that person comes out and, unless the circumstances are unusual, will play a memorized performance of standard literature. So it behooves us then to look into the memory process a little more in detail. In doing this, we have to realize, of course, that the memory process is a component of many different facets. And all of these facets work together at once to achieve a memorized performance. For purposes of this lecture, we're going to separate the facets. And we're going to separate the facets into the motor memory, the memory by ear, the memory by sight, the memory by analysis, and finally a spatial tactile memory, which is close to but a little different from the motor memory. Let's start first with the motor memory. The motor memory is the one that gets the bum rap, because indeed that insecure performance that I described a few moments ago was born of a kind of non-thinking motor memory. The student repeats the passage until it's possible to take the the music away and the fingers go on. There are some cues there probably, but the cues are very reduced, and basically it's down here. Now, I said it had a bum rap because if we have a bad experience, and most of us have or had students, we oftentimes hear the words, well, you depended upon your fingers. And of course, you can't depend on your fingers. And we need to add the word only. You can't depend on your fingers only. When I said it had a bum rap, the motor memory is a very important part of memorized performance and memorized secure performance. Because indeed, the memory operates on reduced cues. You have a number of cues that you feed into the nervous system, and the nervous system sends signals to the muscles, and the muscles then execute that. Now, in extremely rapid music, you can't memorize every note. That is, you can't send cues for every note. And so the in-between notes have to be trusted to the motor memory in the actual performance. That's not to say that you don't know the in-between notes, but in the actual performance, it's only to say that at some point you have to use the cues that are paced right to keep the performance moving. It's kind of like spelling. You know, at some level of your consciousness, when you're writing your notes, at some level of consciousness, you have to know how to spell those words. And yet, as you write, the cues that you're giving your fingers to write the words are not the letters. They're larger cues. So you see, the analogy is very simple. In pieces which are extremely rapid, this is true, such as the Fantasy Impromptu, of which we heard an excerpt. In pieces where there are notes, even if they're not so rapid, where there are notes which are subdued to melodic notes. What comes to mind is the middle section of the famous C-sharp minor prelude of Rachmaninoff. Here we have this pattern, the main melody being this chromatic line, of course, and the other notes being subdued. Now, obviously, the subdued notes are notes that, even though you may know them, the motor has to take care of them in performance. And you can think of innumerable textures where in pieces where indeed those notes that form background patterns and background arabesques have to be taken in the context of the main melody. And much of your attention is focused on the music of the main melody. And then finally, in contrapuntal music, where there is more than one line going at a time, you have indeed to focus on perhaps the line that has the idea. Thus, what happened in the right hand as the answer came in there would be notes that, in fact, I was not focusing directly on. So the motor is very important. Now, there is a technique which I would like to describe to you, which is momentarily not a terribly musical exercise, but it's a very useful exercise. This technique is to play the piece memorized in a painfully slow tempo, using all the concentration you can muster. Now, this is not easy, because what happens is that you have to really understand every working of this in order to make it work. Another example of the painfully slow routine would be the first arabesque of Debussy. The practicing of the polyrhythms at such a slow tempo gives the nervous system clear signals with which to instruct the muscles. As painstaking as this sounds, I invite you to try. This is one of those magic capsules that we teachers all have at lessons. I invite you to try it. I do it often with students who know a piece, but they're experiencing technical difficulty. It's the kind of level that we all know so well, where the piece is pretty good, but it's not too secure. And they say, oh yes, I practice it at home, I practice it at home. And inevitably I say, well, show me how you practice it at home. And inevitably it's a little bit too fast, and then the hunks, the sections are a little bit too large, and all of that kind of. I said, all right, let's take 10 minutes and do an experiment. And so we sit down at the piano together, me sometimes up here, or if there are two pianos at another piano, and I get them to do this piece. That slowly. I said, follow me. And we do it once, twice, and you know, it's like something that's cooking. You know, good cook, just by the smell, they can know when it's about done, you know? And you know, you get so, you can sense, if the student's concentration is pretty good, you can get so you sense when that is really flowing well. And you say, okay, play it up to tempo. And they do, and they have a different feel altogether, and it's a revelation for them. It's one of those little lesson magic tricks that you can do to show them how, in fact, but this is, and memory is part of this, because the concentration is so intense, remembering it at this slow tempo, that this is what gets the signals clear. And it's the best way I know of to prepare motor memory for eventual performance. So the motor memory needs to be established pretty well, not necessarily up to speed, but it needs to be established, and then the memory process, little by little, needs to begin to take place. We've talked about motor, we've talked about its pitfalls, and we've talked about how we have to use it, notwithstanding. So let's now move on into the second area, which is oral memory, memory with the ear. Now, this is an interesting subject which musicians talk about all the time. And we say to our students, but you must learn to listen. And most of the time, what we mean when we say you must learn to listen, what we mean is you have to learn to listen and react to the feedback. And that's not what we're going to talk about here. That is, you have to learn that when you are playing too loudly or when you make an ugly phrase, you have to learn to listen well enough to register what you have done and not do it again or correct it. And that's all well and good. But that's after the fact listening. Now we're going to talk about before the fact listening, or as it's sometimes called, inner hearing. Because it's the inner hearing that rightfully should trigger all musical performance. Inner hearing is very much analogous to conceptualizing a thought or an idea before you say it. If I say, please close the window, before I said that, somewhere in the back of my mind, the concept that the window was open, I didn't want the noise or I didn't want the draft, and I'm going to ask someone to go over and close that thing at the end of the room. Now, that forms very rapidly, in a split second, but it forms clearly enough for me to say, would you please go close the window? Now, similarly, there is a musical oral perception which takes place before the fact and then triggers what it is you play. This is interesting because pianists can become quite proficient without having a very strong image in this regard. It's harder for singers because they have to conceptualize the sound before they can produce it. It's harder for string players or wind players because the quality of the sound, the instrument is flexible enough so that the quality of the sound is markedly affected. And so they have to conceptualize the kind of roundness or the kind of brilliance or whatever it is they want to produce. But we pianists, all we have to do is go here and press a lever, and by golly, we've got sound. And that has led some of us, and people who do not have a strong natural, and these are all aptitudes, gift of inner hearing, that has led some of us to develop quite a facility for pressing those levers. Inner hearing is probably strongest in the people who improvise a lot. Professional improvisers, such as Chick Corea, for example, people who improvise in public. Obviously, their inner hearing has to be very strong because they have to hear what it is they're going to express. And the ideal situation would be that whatever you heard, you could play. Now, people seldom achieve that. And as a matter of fact, in my generation, when I was studying piano, that was even poo-pooed a little bit because, you know, if you played by ear, that was really kind of bad. And that's because there were many people who played by ear, and they usually played pop. And if they tried to play classics, they were all wrong because the ear wasn't that accurate or highly developed, or they didn't understand that much about what they were doing, and they didn't spend that much time at it. So people who played by ear, when I grew up, were kind of sloppy pianists who played a little pop here and there and usually used too much pedal and that kind of thing. And as a result, I see some of you nodding that you know the pattern. And as a result, playing by ear became something that you really avoided because you wanted to be pristine and precise with those scores that you were working with. But we came very nearly to throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because I can tell you that my students not only cannot play by ear, it terrifies them. It absolutely terrifies them. If I ask them to go to the keyboard and play Mary Had a Little Lamb in A flat, that's rough. That's rough. And that is where I suggest that to my students that every day I give them a list of songs that we all know and love. I say, okay, go home and start picking them out. Just pick out the melodies and pick them out in all ranges and pick them out in all keys. Or if they haven't had all keys, then the keys where they have had scales. And when you pick them out, then note what degrees of the scales they follow, because that starts on the third and it goes down to the root. This is all what is taught in solfège naturally. But oftentimes in this country and with our own piano teaching, this kind of aspect of an awareness of how everything fits, and particularly translated to the keyboard, is very much neglected. And of course, it's this long-term thing which will eventually build a relationship with the ear. And then, when the memory starts to go, it's the sound that starts to go first. And then the muscles, which have been trained, and the other imagery follows. That's a very subtle thing, but it's a very important thing. And just like language, It has to be built over years. But because we are pianists, and because of the weakness I have pointed to in our instrument, we oftentimes tend to neglect that. We have it so easy. All we have to do is press a key, and we've got sound. And it's sound that's in pitch, it's in tune. I mean, the piano is either in tune or out of tune, but I mean, it's there. There's nothing we have to do conceptually to alter it. And that's why we have to work particularly hard at this. Without this, I can guarantee that memorization will always be filled with trepidation, because ultimately it's the ear which guides the continuity. And memorization is not only knowing, it's being able to know within the framework of a temporal continuity. Do you sing, Summer? Will you sing along with me?
Okay.
And play at the same time, all right? La, 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 All right, now what I want you to do is to think that melody on the inside. Can you start that? We might not do the entire thing, but start out. Hear that C to the B flat to the E flat. Ready? Let's go. All right, now I could tell that in fact something was going on because I could see your fingers working down here, so that you were having a physiological reaction, and that's not bad. That's perfectly all right. But that tells me that in fact the melody was going on in your head. This is a simple exercise that we need to practice all the time because it strengthens the inner hearing and the inner perception of the melody. The people who have trouble reading music oftentimes compensate for this by the fact that they get the music off the page very quickly. One sees that even in small children. If children are insecure with regard to note identification and they are bright, they will oftentimes take the notes, they will find what they have to do to play the notes and to hear what they have to do to play the notes, and then they will discard the notes. And it's very amusing sometimes to see young children come to a lesson in this situation. They don't look at the music, but they look down at their hands and the keyboard, and they painstakingly find and play one note after another. That way they don't have to look at the music because they know the piece. It's a very interesting psychological thing. They know the piece and somehow they feel that they own the piece because they can play it without the music. Close your eyes for a minute, Summer. All right, now, what do you see on the page in your mind's eye?
Oh, the C in the top hand with the A and the E flat, the 16th notes, and then the A flat and the bass.
All right. You've got a good sense of visually. Let me ask you a question. Do you see the dynamic marking?
It says piano.
Good for you. You've got a strong visual sense because without any one, now that is another sense that helps you memorize. And that little exercise that we just did is very valuable. Close your eyes, see what you see on the page. Then look down here and play those chords. Good for you. One would think that indeed, with regard to visual, total recall would be the dream answer to all memory. If you had photographic memory, as it's called, or really total recall of the page, wouldn't it be wonderful? Because all you'd have to do is to call up the page, and there it would be, and then you could play it. I've worked with a couple of students who had very nearly total recall. They had at least total recall to the extent that upon request they could write down the page. They could really sit at a piece of manuscript paper and think of it and really write down all the notes on the page. And yet, interestingly enough, they were not necessarily secure in memorized performance. And it's because of that aspect of continuity I referred to a moment ago. If something happens in the performance, they can recall the page, all right, but by the time they recall the page, the continuity is lost. So that it's okay if they kind of remember that, but without the other skills, the ear and to some extent the motor and to some extent the harmonic analysis and to some extent the spatial, supporting that total recall, they in fact can get very worried about all of that. Yes, they've got the page in front of them, but it's so easy in the heat of performance to lose your place on the page in terms of the mental recall. And once you've lost the place, then the continuity is broken before you can find it again. So, contrary to what many of us think, that is not the answer that everyone might dream of having. The visual is a very important thing, and I suspect it always will vary from performer to performer how much of it is actually used in the performance. But because the other aspects of memorization are so important, my guess is that it's less than we imagine. Now, let's move on to the big area of work, which is the analytical. This is the great salvation. Whenever we talk about memory problems or memory skills, we always say, well, you've got to know what the music is. And indeed, this is true. We work at it all the time. Or we should work at it all the time. Let me give you some exercises which I think are helpful. And they're very fundamental because when I work and when I ask my students to work at the analytical side of it, I do it in a very methodical way. I say, all right, you want to know this music? Then let's really look at this music in a great deal of detail. For example, if I'm memorizing a melody such as this one in the D-flat prelude of Chopin, I take the melody by itself. I may be using the score. But then I consciously, even to the point of oftentimes saying out loud to myself, all of the fundamental things about the melody. Starts on the third, passes through the root to the fifth, sixth, seventh, root on up to the fourth, which is the top, then it turns around and comes back. Rhythm, dotted, pause, move, pause, move, dotted, move, repeat, and so that all of that, I'm training my ear, the eye may be the same, but I'm also doing all the basic things that reciting a litany of all the basic things that I know about the melody. The same thing happens when I'm doing basic harmonic structure. One oftentimes finds that in music of the classical period, particularly that of Haydn and Mozart, the harmony is outlined within the framework of figural patterns. Here's an example from the K570 last movement of Mozart. You can hear that actually underneath there you have a tonic. And then it changes to the dominant. And once you work in this way, inciting your ear to hear what those harmonies are and flesh them out. You make a kind of arrangement of the piece, but that then makes the pattern extremely clear as to what it's doing, because it's simply outlining those chord changes with some passing tones in between. Now this is painstaking. Oftentimes I have to do it with the score in front of me, but I look at all of these aspects, and finally, suddenly, within actually a very few minutes, maybe 10, 15, I can play that phrase. And I know that phrase. Now I have sat down with a student who was having trouble in memorizing, and I have memorized the opening few bars with them at a lesson. It's an exercise that I do. Inevitably, they will be short on repetitions. Inevitably, they will not want to verbalize these things. And I say, no, we've got to verbalize them. Just don't make me, you say. It starts on the third, it goes to the, no. This is dumb. What is this, a theory lesson? But that's all right. After we finish, and after I say, just follow me for a while, just play this game with me for a while. After we finish, after 10 minutes, and I usually keep it short, I say, now play the phrase. Almost without ever having a failure, the phrase flows like glass. And I say, do you know this phrase of music now? Oh, you bet I do. Well, two things. I say, you won't know it tomorrow because it'll slip. But you start this way again tomorrow, and instead of taking 10 minutes, and that's all it took us, was 10 minutes to go this far, instead of knowing it in 10 minutes, you'll know it again in 3 because it'll come back very rapidly. Then you can go on a little bit. Now the other thing is that this presupposes some memory work every day, like warming up exercises, like finger exercises, like scales, like technique. Memory work is part of your daily routine because it becomes a way in which you strengthen your powers of observation and ultimately will cut the time. Now it is true that in the beginning you spend more time and more detailed time in this kind of analytical process than you do the other way. But you avoid the wasteland because once you know the piece, by golly, you know it. Now that still doesn't mean that you won't be frightened in performance, and it still doesn't mean that you won't have continuity problems. We'll talk a little bit more later about that. But it does mean that you know your piece, and that at least puts one thing to rest, that I know the piece. I can do the piece. Whether I can do it on that occasion the way I want to may be another question, as it always is, but I know the music. And it is quite possible, even in relatively complex music, to feel that way about a piece. Takes a lot of hard drilling and a lot of hard work. We talked about that melodic line, and we talked about the structure. What degree of the scale does that open on?
The third.
It opens on the third, right? Then it goes to the second.
And then to the fifth.
And then it hops up to the fifth. And then notice that he goes back down to the third, you see? Mm-hmm. Now, that's a characteristic of this particular melody. Many melodies start on the root, but here you have 3, 2, 5, 4, 3. So the little circle of pattern of that's home key, that's tonic. Do, those are 1, 5, 1s, and that little circle of melody goes from the third up to the fifth and back to the third. Most of all, you have to have the assurance that underneath the performance, underneath the motor, is the knowledge of what the piece is made up of. That you know what the harmonic progression is. You know where the melody starts and you know where it ends. You know what the structures are. You know what the phrases are. You know where the dynamics are. You know where the staccatos are. This requires lots of work and on a long continuing basis. You do reach a point where you can say, I do know this piece of music. Now, I want to talk about a process which I think is extremely important, and that is developing a personal, physical relationship with the keyboard. The two operative words are physical relationship, that you understand, but a personal physical relationship. And that's the difference that I'm trying to highlight here. We all teach our chords. I mean, you know, we can always do that. You know, we teach our chords, hopefully. We all teach arpeggios and scales. But these are patterns in which we are striving to mold our physical relationship to a pre-existing pattern. When we learn our pieces, we are striving to mold our physical relationship to a pre-existing pattern. Let me give you a story. The other day, I had what is actually a graduate student of mine come in and was having some problems with the memorized, and I said, just on a, this was a student I haven't had very long, I said, just on a hunch, I said, do something in C major for me. C major? Yeah, something in C major. Well, do something more. I said, well, can't you, do something more than that? I mean, make C major. What do you mean? I said, just make C major all over the place. And this was a totally strange experience. I finally got this student to do it. But I said, okay, now make C minor all over the place. And I want you to go home and I want you to just try it. Oh, you mean, well, I know, I took a class in improvising once, but I hated that class and I couldn't do that. But even in the class of improvising, someone was passing on the quality of your musical thought. That's not the issue. I don't care whether it's original. I don't care whether the voice leading is right. I don't care whether the phrase is balanced. I don't care about anything. I just want you to make sound at the keyboard. And then the next step is to begin to react emotionally to that sound. You want to play Beethoven? All right, let's play Beethoven. It's only F minor. Do you want to play Chopin? Do something, and of course you see what I'm doing. I'm beginning to lead them in to the keyboard as a personal means of expression and with a physical relationship where they feel free to roam at this instrument of their choice. Roam just being able to create a mood. I said to them, sometimes I don't have to do anything complicated or wonderful. Sometimes I can sit down late at night just a few notes, and it reflects a mood that I'm in. I'm tired, I'm kind of dreamy, I'm a little wistful. And it's wonderful just to be able to sit down, and it doesn't have to make good sense, it doesn't have to make any sense, except ultimately you begin to hear and you begin to have a physical, spatial relationship. The late Cecile Ganhart at the Eastman School used to have all kinds of wonderful, funny tricks that she used to ask her students to be able to come in and do. They were not. It was not for. It was kind of for technical flexibility, but it was really just to get acquainted with the keyboard time. You know, play C major in the left hand and E in the right. You know, play 2 against 3. Reverse it. She used to have all kinds of things that she would ask. But my point here is that we never develop that physical relationship. We never develop the idea of being comfortable. How does that impact on memory? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. If I start the Waldstein Sonata, and this is true confession time, and undoubtedly this reflects to some degree the biases of my own strengths, but still, it's a powerful thing. If I start the Waldstein Sonata, I hope that I hear that C major chord, and I hope I hear my tempo, and that leads me, but I'm very much here with a C major chord. And although I may not have my eyes glued on that C major chord, to that D7, to that G in the first inversion, and all that's functioning too, like spelling again, although I may not have my eyes glued to that, I'm very much aware of that physical relationship, so that when I play a memorized performance, that physical, geographical relationship is very much a part of it. Now, you find a student who is not aware of that and who is uncomfortable with it, and interestingly enough, they will do anything to keep from looking at their hands. Oh, that confuses me. And that's because they have never thought of all of the music in relationship to how it's laid out on that keyboard. And that's a very, very important kind of contributing strength for memorized security. Without it, I personally would feel lost. And I have sometimes really had to pull teeth to get students to begin to develop and build that relationship. But within a very, very, very few weeks, they are delighted. They find a security that they never knew they had before. And memorized performance becomes then not only hearing, not only maybe reflecting on the page, not only letting the motor take control, not only knowing the harmony, but it becomes this thing down here, this thing, these positions. Now, by itself, it's treacherous. You've got to have the rest of it too. You've got to have other things operating. But without it, all of the rest of it is less secure. Once something is memorized, we still are faced with the fear that maybe you'll have a memory slip. And of course, memory slips are oftentimes not really memory slips. They are lapses in concentration, which can easily happen because the adrenaline is flowing, and just as you walked on stage, you saw your Aunt Hattie in the audience and you didn't know she was coming, and she was an ex-piano teacher and she'll be very critical, and all of those things. And you know, we always have someone we see in the audience who we somehow feel shouldn't be there because they will spot all of our weaknesses. All of those things are intruding on us as we perform, and therefore we have little lapses in concentration. In order to forestall this, or in order to secure it, there is a whole raft of tests that are well known, they're time honored, they're like scales and arpeggios, or practicing in rhythms and all of the stuff that we pianists do. But they are memory tests, and there's a number of them. I could have included that very slow practice as one of these tests also. Some of the tests are to play long segments of hands separately, alone. That sometimes will help secure. You see, and by doing that, sometimes you can't go on. Sometimes you have to activate the right hand because the left hand won't know where to go by itself. Because by doing that, you see, I become painfully aware of exactly what that skip is when it drops back to the G sharp. And so at that point, when I execute the piece, I'm probably busy up here with the right hand, and the left hand kind of takes care of itself. And it's at that point when one of those little imps will come crawling out of the piano in performance and say, does the left hand really know where to go at this point? You know the patterns well. But you see, by doing that, we can't focus on all things at once. But by doing that, we quiet those little imps. Because you say, no, I know my left hand. I know my left hand. Another thing that we oftentimes do is to block small sections and then shuffle them. For example, you might try now. See, I played it backwards. I played it measure by measure backwards. I had to think of what the harmony was, and I had to start each of those measures. Now that too takes practice. So you unitize the sections, and you either play them backwards, or you play a measure and then skip a measure and then play the next measure, and then you do the alternate measure. Those are all very mechanical things, but believe me, they do make a difference. Another technique which is used along these lines is one of switching registers, because the spatial aspect of the entire memory process is disturbed by the switching registers. Therefore, the mind has to reinforce what the notes actually are, so that I might play. My normal coordination is thus changed, but it makes me think and makes me realize and tests me whether I really know the notes. That's what I mean when I said it takes time and it takes a lot of work. And of course, I'm operating, you say, well, you're operating at a level that's very complex, way up here. What about the student? But it's the same. It's the same. Because they can have the same kind of security, and whether you're doing the Merry Farmer or whether you're doing the Scriabin Ninth Sonata, the procedure does not differ. It does not differ one iota. You see, memory problems and secure memory do not necessarily guarantee that you can handle pressure. That's a different matter. Secure memory will go a long way toward helping you handle that pressure, but there are all kinds of things which come into play which may throw you off the horse at the moment of battle. In fact, there are people who, as far as the memory is concerned, could write down their pieces, or they can tell you every note on every page, or they can whistle every note on every page. And yet, because of the continuity and the pressure, they, like the rest of us, feel the fear that attends every public performance. There's an old saw which says memory is like a muscle. You have to use it. And to a certain extent, that's true. You have to memorize every day. It no longer becomes strange or exotic or indeed very trying if you spend a little time memorizing every day. Even contemporary works, which are very complex and which it takes an enormous amount of effort and time to memorize, I prefer to play without the notes. I prefer that, and I prefer to risk the insecurity and the fear of going on stage in public and playing it, because when I go out there and play it, the concentration is there, and I feel like I'm really crawling around on the inside of that score. And I know those notes so well that somehow the score has become part of me, and so I am indeed a co-creator with the composer. Now roll the 16ths for me, meaning play it as written, that much. All right, it's a beginning. So these are the many things that we do in order to secure memory. So you're still backstage, and you have to walk out and do this memorized performance, and you still don't know. Well, that's the business. None of us, I don't know if you remember that wonderful picture of Arthur Rubinstein. Seems to me it was in Life magazine on the occasion of his 75th or 80th birthday. And it showed Arthur Rubinstein backstage warming his hands over a radiator. It was in Boston. And the caption was a quote from Mr. Rubinstein, and for me it was one of the most wonderful gifts he could have given his colleagues. The quote was, "Fear before every performance is the price I must pay for the marvelous life I lead." And if after 70 years of being a performer, he could say that, he passed on to us the knowledge that even the very great ones have to go through the same thing that we go through and our students go through every time they step out on stage, no matter what the experience, no matter what the preparation. With all the pitfalls, and memorization is certainly one of the real challenges, with all the pitfalls, our lives are blessed because of what we do and the art we love. Thank you so much.